Richard Holloway liked systems that behaved. Markets rose and fell, but patterns existed. People lied, but incentives didn't. Machines failed, but only when someone ignored maintenance. For most of his adult life, Richard built his fortune on one belief. If you watched closely enough, nothing truly surprised you. He didn't call it control. He called it awareness. The house reflected that mindset. Glass walls angled toward the trees. Motion sensors embedded in the floor. Lights that adjusted automatically to the time of day. Everything designed to respond before anyone had to ask. Visitors admired it. Journalists wrote about it. Richard barely noticed it anymore. What he did notice were gaps. Blind spots bothered him, especially the ones involving his son. Daniel Holloway lived in the same house, but in a different emotional climate. Where Richard's days were segmented into meetings and metrics, Daniel's life moved slower, thoughtfully. He noticed things his father didn't. The way the gardener hummed the same tune every morning. The way the kitchen clock lost a second every few days. The way his father never sat down unless there was a reason. Daniel was 21, tall, sharp-eyed, and quieter than people expected. When strangers met him, they often mistook his reserve for arrogance. Richard knew better. His son simply listened more than he spoke. It was something Daniel learned early, after his mother died and the house became quieter in a way money couldn't fix. Richard loved his son. He was certain of that. He just expressed it differently. He provided. He planned. He anticipated risk. He watched. When Daniel was younger, Richard tracked his grades online before report cards arrived. He installed location sharing on Daniel's phone, in case of emergencies. He knew which friends Daniel spent time with, not because Daniel told him, but because Richard paid attention. Daniel tolerated it. Mostly. "You don't have to manage me like a portfolio," Daniel once said, half smiling. Richard had laughed then. Everything worth keeping deserves oversight. Daniel didn't argue. He rarely did. That was the problem Richard didn't see yet. Silence felt like agreement. Calm felt like acceptance. And distance felt safe. On the outside, Richard's life looked settled. Successful. Predictable. He flew between Palo Alto and Vancouver, Toronto, New York. He appeared on conference panels. He donated to research institutions. He funded innovation labs that carried other people's names. But at night, alone in hotel rooms, Richard checked feeds. Stock charts. News alerts. Security updates from the house. He liked knowing nothing unexpected was happening while he was gone. When Daniel started college nearby, Richard convinced himself it was coincidence. Stanford was close. Prestigious. Logical. He ignored the quieter truth that Daniel had chosen proximity. Not dependence. Proximity. The night before the accident, Richard was packing for a short trip north. Daniel stood in the doorway of his father's study, hands in his pockets. "I'm going to grab groceries tomorrow," Daniel said. "You want anything specific?" Richard didn't look up from his tablet. "Whatever you usually get is fine." Daniel lingered. "I'll probably take the Audi." "Take it," Richard said. "Drive carefully. It's supposed to rain." Daniel nodded. He hesitated like he wanted to say something else. Then he turned away. Richard never noticed. Later that night, Richard checked the weather. Light rain. Nothing unusual. He set an alert for the house systems, locked his phone, and went to sleep believing everything was accounted for. That was the lie he lived inside. Because there are moments when the world doesn't announce itself. It doesn't warn you. It doesn't care how prepared you think you are. And Richard Holloway was about to learn that watching everything still doesn't mean you see what matters. If you're still here listening to this story unfold, you already know how rare it is to really see inside another person's life. Stories like this don't reveal themselves all at once. Sometimes you have to stay a little longer to understand what went wrong. The rain started earlier than predicted. And somewhere on a dark stretch of highway, a system failed. The kind no one was monitoring. Daniel Holloway did not believe silence meant emptiness. That misunderstanding belonged to other people. Loud people. People who filled rooms because they were afraid of what happened when nothing was said. Daniel liked quiet. It let him think. He had learned that early after his mother died, and the house seemed to inhale and forget how to breathe out again. Richard threw himself into work. Meetings multiplied. Assistants appeared and disappeared. The kitchen stayed stocked, the bills were paid, and grief was handled the way everything else was handled in the Holloway household, efficiently and privately. Daniel adapted. At 9 years old, he learned how to pour his own cereal without spilling. At 12, he learned which questions not to ask his father late at night. By 15, he learned that if he waited long enough, people would eventually tell him the truth just to break the silence. It wasn't manipulation. It was observation. At Stanford, that habit made him stand out. Professors liked him because he listened. Classmates trusted him because he didn't rush to fill space with opinions. When he spoke, people leaned in. Not because he was loud. Because he was deliberate. He chose biomedical engineering for reasons he rarely explained. When asked, he usually shrugged and said, "It makes sense." That was only part of it. Twice a week, Daniel volunteered at a rehabilitation clinic in San Jose. He didn't tell his father at first. Not because he was hiding it, but because he didn't feel the need to announce it. The clinic smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. The floor squeaked. The equipment was outdated. But the people were real in a way Daniel found grounding. He worked mostly with kids. Teenagers too. People learning how to move again. Or learning how to live differently. He never tried to motivate them with speeches. He adjusted straps. Held clipboards. Sat quietly when someone needed to cry without being watched. One afternoon, a boy no older than 13 asked him, "Do you think I'll walk again?" Daniel didn't answer right away. "I think," he said carefully, "you'll learn things about yourself that other people never have to. That doesn't make it fair. But it makes it something." The boy nodded. That was enough. Daniel drove home that night feeling tired in a good way. Useful. Richard noticed the fatigue but misread it as academic pressure. "You don't have to push yourself so hard," Richard said once, glancing at Daniel's schedule on his tablet. "I'm not," Daniel replied. "I'm choosing." Richard smiled at that. He liked the word choice. But there were things Daniel didn't say. He didn't say that sometimes, while watching patients struggle with basic movements, he wondered how fragile everything really was. He didn't say that he noticed how quickly independence could disappear. He didn't say that he thought about control differently than his father did. To Daniel, control was an illusion. To Richard, it was a strategy. They coexisted in that difference without confronting it. The night before the accident, Daniel stood in his doorway longer than usual. He watched his father work, fingers moving across glass, eyes sharp, focused. "Everything okay?" Richard asked without looking up. "Yeah," Daniel said. He considered mentioning the clinic. The kids. The boy who had finally managed to lift his leg without assistance that afternoon. He imagined his father's nod. His polite interest. His distant pride. Daniel swallowed the words. Instead he said, "I'll be back before dark tomorrow." Richard nodded. "Text me when you leave." Daniel hesitated. "I'm 21, he said lightly. Richard finally looked up. "Humor me." Daniel smiled. Not because it was funny. Because it was easier. Later, alone in his room, Daniel packed his bag for class and set his alarm. He checked the weather. Light rain. Nothing dramatic. He lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the clinic. About how people adjusted to new limits. About how quickly life could narrow. He didn't know why those thoughts lingered. He didn't know that within 24 hours, his world would shrink to the width of a hospital bed. That silence would no longer be something he chose. And he didn't know that the quiet boy who learned to observe instead of speak was about to become the most watched person in his father's life. The rain tapped softly against the window. Daniel closed his eyes. Somewhere between sleep and morning, Everything he understood about his body was still intact. For now. Tuesday arrived without ceremony. No alarms. No bad omens. Just a thin gray sky and the quiet rhythm of a house that had already learned how to function without conversation. Daniel woke early. He always did on days he volunteered. The habit stuck even on weeks when classes started later. He showered, dressed, and stood for a moment in front of the mirror, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He looked the same as always. No hint that this day would be different from any other. Downstairs, the kitchen lights came on automatically. The coffee machine hummed to life. Daniel poured cereal, then changed his mind and made eggs instead. He ate standing up, scrolling through messages from classmates. Nothing urgent. Nothing that needed answering right away. Outside, the air felt heavier than usual. The rain hadn't started yet, but it was coming. You could smell it. That sharp, metallic scent that clung to the back of the throat. Daniel grabbed his keys from the counter. The Audi's key fob felt cool in his palm. "Heading out," he called. Richard's voice floated down from upstairs. "Text me when you leave." Daniel paused, then smiled to himself. "Leaving now." He sent the text anyway. The drive to the clinic was routine. He knew every bend of the road, every stretch where traffic slowed without reason. He parked in the same spot, nodded to the receptionist, and spent the next few hours adjusting straps, wiping down equipment, and listening more than he spoke. The rain started while he was inside. By the time Daniel stepped back out into the parking lot, the pavement was slick and reflective. The sky had darkened faster than expected. He pulled his jacket tighter and glanced at his phone. No new messages. No missed calls. On impulse, he decided to stop for groceries before heading home. It was practical, efficient, something his father would appreciate. The store was busy. People moved quickly, carts squeaking, conversations overlapping. Daniel grabbed what he needed without much thought. Milk, bread, fruit. A box of cereal he hadn't had since he was a kid. At the checkout, the cashier made small talk about the weather. "Came out of nowhere," she said. Daniel nodded. "It usually does." By the time he loaded the bags into the trunk, the rain was steady. Not violent. Just enough to blur headlights and soften edges. He pulled onto the highway and turned the radio low. The road curved ahead, slick but familiar. Daniel drove carefully. He always did. Both hands on the wheel. Speed just under the limit. A few miles in, traffic slowed. Red brake lights flickered like warnings. Daniel eased off the gas. The rain intensified, drumming against the windshield. The wipers struggled to keep up. Then it happened too fast to fully register. A delivery truck ahead fishtailed. The trailer swung wide, blocking lanes. Tires screamed. Someone honked. Daniel's body reacted before his thoughts did. He swerved. The guardrail loomed, closer than it should have been. Metal met metal with a sound that didn't belong on a normal afternoon. The world jolted violently sideways. For a fraction of a second, everything went quiet. Then the impact came. The car flipped. Once. Twice. Glass shattered. The weightlessness was brief but terrifying, like being dropped without warning. Groceries exploded from the trunk. The radio cut out mid-word. When the car finally stopped moving, the rain rushed back in. Daniel hung suspended by the seatbelt, disoriented. His ears rang. His chest burned with shallow breaths. He tried to move. Nothing happened. He tried again, willing his arms to respond. His fingers didn't obey. Panic rose, sharp and immediate. "Hey!" he whispered, though there was no one to hear him. The rain seeped through cracks in the broken windows, cold against his skin. Sirens sounded somewhere far away, then closer. Or maybe that was his pulse in his ears. Daniel stared at the shattered windshield, blinking rain from his eyes. He focused on breathing. Something was wrong. He knew that much. At home, Richard's phone buzzed. An unknown number. He didn't answer it right away. And in the wreckage of a twisted car on a rain-darkened highway, Daniel Holloway waited, unable to move, unable to call out, while the last ordinary moments of his life slipped quietly away. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. Richard noticed that first. Not the urgency. Not the flashing lights or the clipped voices. Just the smell. It reminded him of efficiency. Of places where systems existed for every possible failure. That comfort lasted exactly 3 minutes. The emergency room doors burst open as Daniel's gurney rolled through. His clothes had been cut away. His skin looked pale under the harsh lights. A thin line of blood traced along his temple. Machines surrounded him almost immediately, beeping in patterns Richard didn't yet understand. "Mr. Holloway?" a nurse asked, already steering him aside. "We need you to stand back." Richard complied automatically. He watched hands move, gloved, practiced, fast. He watched someone press on Daniel's chest. Someone else checked his pupils. A voice called out numbers. Another voice answered. No one looked panicked. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. "How bad is it?" Richard asked, his voice steady in a way that surprised even him. A doctor glanced up briefly. "We're still assessing. There was significant trauma. We'll know more after imaging." Imaging. Assessment. Language Richard understood. He nodded and stepped back, folding his arms like he was observing a demonstration instead of his son lying motionless on a gurney. Hours blurred together. Consent forms appeared. Richard signed them without reading every line. He trusted institutions. He trusted expertise. He told himself this was what preparation looked like. Surgery happened somewhere he wasn't allowed to go. Richard sat in a chair bolted to the floor and stared at the double doors. Around him, other families whispered, cried, prayed. He checked his phone out of habit, then stopped when he realized how absurd that was. For the first time in years, there was nothing to monitor. A doctor finally approached just after midnight. Middle-aged. Calm. Tired. "Mr. Holloway," he said. "Your son is stable." Richard exhaled slowly. "And?" The doctor hesitated. That was new. "There was a spinal injury," he said carefully. "Severe. We performed emergency surgery to reduce swelling and prevent further damage." Richard waited. "We won't know the full extent until he wakes up," the doctor continued. "But I want to be honest with you. This is serious." Richard nodded. "I understand." "You didn't?" "Not really. Not yet." Daniel was moved to the ICU. Tubes. Wires. Monitors. His chest rose and fell mechanically. Richard sat beside him and watched the machines do what bodies were supposed to do on their own. For the first time since Daniel was a child, Richard reached out and held his son's hand. It felt warm. Alive. That had to mean something. Daniel woke 2 days later. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden gasping or confusion. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then searching. "Hey," Richard said immediately, leaning forward. "I'm here." Daniel blinked. His throat worked as if swallowing hurt. "What happened?" "You were in an accident," Richard said. "You're in the hospital. You're safe." Daniel processed that quietly. He didn't ask about the car, or the rain, or the truck. Instead, he asked the question Richard had been dreading since the doctor's hesitation. "Can I move my hands?" The room went very still. A nurse glanced at Richard, then at the doctor standing just inside the doorway. Richard answered before anyone else could. "Not right now," he said. His voice was controlled, almost gentle. "But you just woke up. It's too early to know everything." Daniel stared at the ceiling. He didn't look at his hands. He didn't try to move them again. "Okay," he said. That was it. No shouting. No anger. No tears. Richard felt something twist painfully in his chest. Over the next hours, doctors explained. C6, C7. Complete injury. Words stacked on top of each other, heavy and final. Richard asked questions. Precise ones. About trials. About recovery rates. About timelines. The answers grew less certain the more he pressed. Daniel listened without interrupting. When they were alone again, he spoke softly. "I can't feel my legs," he said. Not a question. An observation. Richard nodded. "I know. Is this permanent?" Richard hesitated for half a second too long. "We don't know yet," he said. Daniel closed his eyes. His breathing stayed even. Too even. That night, Richard stayed by his son's bed, watching the monitors flicker. He memorized the rhythm of the machines. He learned what each beep meant. Control, he told himself, was returning. But as the hours passed and Daniel lay awake in silence, staring into a future neither of them could yet name, one truth pressed heavily into the space between them. This was not a system failure. This was something no amount of preparation had prevented. And when Daniel whispered, barely audible, "Dad, don't let them lie to me," Richard realized he was already standing at the edge of a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Daniel came home on a Thursday. The date mattered to Richard. He wrote it down. Not because anyone asked him to, but because he needed a marker, something to separate the before from whatever this was now. The house had been changing for weeks. Ramps replaced steps. Doorways were widened with surgical precision. Railings appeared along walls that had once been purely decorative. The guest bathroom was gutted and rebuilt into something that looked more like a private clinic than a place meant for living. Richard supervised every modification personally. He approved measurements. He tested angles. He argued with contractors about clearance space. He wanted nothing left to chance. When the transport van pulled into the driveway, the house was silent. No music. No staff moving about. Just the soft hum of systems waiting to respond. Daniel was wheeled in carefully, his body secured, his expression unreadable. He took in the changes without comment. His eyes moved slowly, cataloging what had been altered and what hadn't. "This used to be stairs," he said quietly as they passed the entryway. "It's safer this way," Richard replied. Daniel nodded. "Yeah." The hospital bed had replaced Daniel's desk. That was the hardest part for Richard to look at. The desk had been cluttered with notebooks, half-finished projects, old coffee mugs. It was where Daniel had studied late into the night, where he had built things that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. Now it was gone, dismantled and stored somewhere Daniel hadn't asked about. In its place stood something mechanical, adjustable. Daniel was transferred slowly, methodically. Nurses explained each step even though Daniel didn't ask questions. When they finished and left, the room felt too large. Richard stood awkwardly near the door. "Let me know if you need anything," he said. Daniel stared at the ceiling. "I will." "You didn't?" The first few days passed in a careful rhythm. Nurses arrived in shifts. Therapists visited on schedules that were posted and color-coded. Daniel complied with everything. He answered questions. He followed instructions. He didn't complain. That worried Richard. He had expected anger, or grief, or something loud and unmanageable. Instead, Daniel became efficient. He endured. At night, when the house went quiet, Richard sometimes walked past Daniel's room and paused. The door was usually open. Daniel lay still, eyes open, watching shadows move across the ceiling. "Can't sleep?" Richard asked once. Daniel blinked slowly. "I'm sleeping. Just not dreaming." Richard didn't know what that meant, but it sounded final. Meals changed too. Daniel ate what was prepared, but without interest. Food became something that happened to him, not something he enjoyed. He chewed carefully, swallowed mechanically, and thanked whoever fed him. "Do you want something else?" Richard asked one afternoon. Daniel shook his head. "This is fine." Everything was fine. That was the phrase that began to echo through the house, hollow and unconvincing. One afternoon, Richard brought up a clinical trial he'd read about. "Stem cells. Experimental. Early stage. There's a facility in Boston," Richard said, standing at the foot of the bed. "I can have them review your case." Daniel listened. He always did. Okay, he said. Do you want to? Richard pressed. Daniel turned his head slightly, meeting his father's eyes. Do you? The question caught Richard off guard. I want every option on the table, he said. Daniel looked away. Then sure. Richard left the room feeling strangely unsatisfied. The house adjusted around Daniel, but something essential didn't recalibrate. Conversations became shorter. Silences stretched longer. Richard found himself talking at Daniel instead of with him. Late one night, Richard heard a sound that didn't belong. A sharp inhale. Then another. He hurried into Daniel's room to find him awake, eyes wide, breath uneven. Hey, Richard said quickly. What's wrong? Daniel swallowed. Nothing. Just couldn't catch my breath for a second. Richard reached for the call button, then stopped himself. Daniel was already steady again. I'm fine, Daniel repeated. Richard stood there longer than necessary, watching his son breathe, counting each rise and fall of his chest like a system check. When he finally left, he stood in the hallway, hand pressed against the wall, feeling the house vibrate faintly with electricity and quiet. He realized then that the house was prepared for emergencies. What it wasn't prepared for was watching someone disappear slowly while insisting they were still there. And for the first time since Daniel came home, Richard wondered, not for the last time, whether all this careful preparation was helping his son survive, or simply making it easier to observe him fading. Nights became the hardest part. During the day there were schedules, therapists, checklists taped neatly to the refrigerator. There was movement in the house, even if Daniel's body no longer provided it. Activity created the illusion of progress. At night there was nothing to hide behind. The house dimmed itself automatically at 10. Hallway lights softened. Security systems armed quietly. The same routines that once made Richard feel calm now felt intrusive, like the house was too aware of its own silence. Daniel rarely slept. He lay awake, eyes open, listening to the subtle sounds most people ignored. The distant hum of the ventilation system. The faint click of cooling pipes. The almost inaudible whir of electricity running through walls. His body felt heavy. Not painful. Just distant. Like it belonged to someone else and he was renting space inside it. Around 3 in the morning the thoughts always came. He thought about the clinic in San Jose. About the kids learning to sit upright again. About the patience it took to strap someone into a device they hated because it might help them later. He wondered what those kids would think if they saw him now. He wondered if they would recognize him at all. Richard started noticing the lights under Daniel's door when he passed by at night. At first he ignored it. People healed differently. Sleep patterns shifted. That was normal. But after the 4th night in a row he stopped. He knocked softly. Daniel? Pause. Then, yeah. Richard stepped inside. Daniel lay flat, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The glow from a small lamp cast long shadows across his face. Can't sleep? Richard asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. I sleep. I just don't stay asleep. Richard nodded, unsure what to do with his hands. He settled into the chair beside the bed, something he rarely did anymore. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and clean linen. It didn't smell like Daniel. Do you want me to call someone? Richard asked. The nurse? They can adjust. No, Daniel said quickly. Then softer, no. I'm okay. They sat in silence for a moment. The kind that used to feel comfortable between them. I don't dream anymore, Daniel said suddenly. Richard turned to him. What do you mean? I mean, before when I slept there were places, sounds, things happening. Daniel swallowed. Now it's just black. Like my brain doesn't know what to do with the rest of me. Richard searched for something useful to say. He came up empty. Maybe it's the medication, he offered. Maybe, Daniel said. He didn't sound convinced. Richard watched his son's face carefully. The calm expression. The controlled breathing. It reminded him of investors who stayed quiet right before walking away from a deal. "Are you scared?" Richard asked. Daniel didn't answer right away. "I don't know what scared feels like anymore," he said finally. "I think I used it all up." The words landed heavier than any outburst could have. Richard stayed longer that night. He listened to Daniel breathe. He watched his eyes close, not in sleep but in surrender to rest. After that, Richard began adjusting his own schedule. He stayed up later. He worked from home more. He told himself it was temporary. But the nights didn't improve. Daniel's world continued to narrow. His voice softened. His responses shortened. He stopped asking about classes. Stopped checking emails. Days blended together without edges. One morning, a therapist asked Daniel how he was feeling emotionally. "I'm fine," Daniel said. The therapist nodded, wrote something down, and moved on. Richard watched the exchange from the doorway, unease creeping into his chest. Fine was becoming a shield, one no one seemed willing to test. That evening, Richard stood alone in the control room he barely acknowledged existed, a small space where the house's systems converged. Screens displayed security feeds, temperature readings, energy usage. He stared at the blank monitor reserved for optional add-ons. Cameras. He hadn't planned it yet. Not fully. But the thought had been circling for days. What if something happened at night? What if Daniel needed help and couldn't call for it? What if Richard wasn't there when it mattered? Awareness, he reminded himself, was not the same as intrusion. He reached out and tapped the screen. A menu opened. Richard didn't select anything yet. But the idea had taken shape. And once it did, it refused to leave him alone. Richard didn't install the cameras all at once. He started with research. Discrete systems. Medical-grade monitoring disguised as home security. Encrypted feeds. No third-party access. He read white papers, consulted private security firms, and asked questions that made people assume he was protecting assets, not a person. The justification came easily. Daniel couldn't press call buttons reliably. His breathing had become uneven at night. There were moments, brief, frightening ones, when his eyes widened and his chest tightened before settling again. Richard told himself those moments were warnings, data points, indicators that something needed to change. He didn't frame it as surveillance. He framed it as care. When the equipment arrived, it was installed quietly. Small lenses embedded high in corners. No blinking lights. No audible hum. They blended into the architecture the way everything else in the house did. Before activating anything, Richard sat with Daniel. He didn't rush the conversation. That part mattered to him. "I want to add a few safety measures," Richard said, standing near the bed. "Nothing invasive. Just extra awareness." Daniel's eyes shifted toward him. "What kind of awareness?" "Cameras," Richard said. He kept his voice neutral. "In the common areas. And here. Positioned carefully." Daniel stared at him for a long moment. "So you can watch me?" Daniel asked. "So I can know you're okay," Richard replied. The distinction felt important. Daniel didn't respond right away. His jaw tightened slightly, then relaxed. "Are they on all the time?" "Yes." "Who can see them?" "Only me." Daniel exhaled slowly. "And if I say no?" Richard hesitated. Not long enough to be obvious. Just long enough to matter. "I'd be uncomfortable with that," he said. "But I'd respect it." Daniel studied his father's face. The concern. The tension. The unspoken fear. "I don't care," Daniel said finally. "It's not like I can go anywhere." The words landed harder than a refusal would have. Richard nodded, relief and guilt colliding in his chest. "Thank you." That night he activated the system. The first time Richard opened the feed, his heart raced. Daniel lay asleep, chest rising and falling steadily. The image was clear, stable, reassuring. Richard slept better that night than he had in months. Over the next few days, checking the cameras became a habit. A glance while making coffee. A look before meetings. A final check before bed. Each time Daniel was where he should be. Safe. Accounted for. That was the word Richard used in his mind. Accounted for. But something subtle shifted. Richard began noticing things he hadn't before. The way Daniel's eyes followed the ceiling fan when he was bored. The way his jaw tightened when a nurse spoke too loudly. The way he stared at the doorway long after someone left. Daniel, meanwhile, grew quieter. Not in a dramatic way. In a careful one. He stopped sighing. Stopped closing his eyes when frustrated. He kept his face neutral, like someone aware of being observed. One afternoon, Richard walked into Daniel's room and found him staring at the ceiling. "Everything okay?" Richard asked. Daniel blinked. "Yeah. You seem distant." Daniel hesitated, then said, "It's weird knowing someone's always there." "I'm not watching all the time," Richard said quickly. Daniel gave a small smile. "You don't have to be." Richard didn't know how to respond to that. The cameras captured everything, but they didn't explain anything. They showed Richard that Daniel was safe. They also showed him that safety had come at a cost he didn't yet understand. Late one night, while reviewing footage, Richard noticed Daniel whisper something to himself. The audio didn't pick it up. Richard leaned closer to the screen as if proximity might fill in the gap. It didn't. For the first time since installing the system, Richard felt the discomfort of knowing more and understanding less. And as he closed the app and set his phone down, he missed the quiet ignorance he used to mistake for peace. The caregivers arrived in shifts, like interchangeable parts in a system Richard trusted more than people. Resumes were vetted. Background checks cleared. Schedules optimized. On paper, everything looked ideal. In practice, it rarely was. The first nurse stayed 2 weeks. She was efficient, brisk, and always slightly rushed. She spoke to Daniel loudly, as if volume could bridge the gap between mobility and understanding. "All right, sweetie," she'd say, adjusting his pillows without asking. "Let's get you comfortable." Daniel never corrected her. Richard noticed the way Daniel's eyes drifted to the window whenever she entered the room. He noticed the long pauses before Daniel answered simple questions. The cameras caught it all. After one particularly tense afternoon, Richard watched as the nurse left Daniel's arm twisted slightly at an unnatural angle. Daniel's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. That night, Richard fired her. The second caregiver smiled too much. She called Daniel champ and praised him excessively for things he didn't do. "You're doing great," she'd say after repositioning him. "Look at you." Daniel stared past her, expression blank. "She means well," Richard told himself. Intentions mattered, right? The cameras showed Daniel flinch when she touched him unexpectedly. The praise didn't land. It embarrassed him. She was gone within a week. The third caregiver lasted longer. He was quiet, professional, almost invisible. That should have been ideal. Then one morning, a prescription bottle went missing. The cameras confirmed it. A brief moment. A pocket. A glance at the door. Richard confronted him with footage. The man didn't deny it. "You don't need this job," Richard said flatly. The caregiver left without argument. Daniel watched from his bed, eyes following the door as it closed. "Sorry," he said quietly. Richard frowned. "For what?" "For being work." Richard didn't answer. After that, caregivers blurred together. Some stayed days. Some hours. None stayed long enough for Daniel to learn their rhythms. None stayed long enough for the house to feel settled. Each arrival brought new rules. New ways of touching him. New voices explaining his body back to him like he wasn't there. The cameras gave Richard clarity. And distance. He saw every mistake. Every misstep. He saw enough to justify every termination. What he didn't see was what happened between the moments he reviewed. He didn't hear the sighs Daniel swallowed. He didn't feel the tension in Daniel's body when hands approached without warning. One afternoon, a caregiver spoke to another staff member outside Daniel's room. "He doesn't react much," she said. Hard to tell if he's even there sometimes. Daniel lay still, staring at the ceiling. The cameras captured his eyes filling slowly with tears he didn't let fall. That evening, Richard reviewed the footage twice. He fired her the next morning. By the time the agency suggested a new hire, Richard's trust in people had eroded almost completely. He believed in systems, in oversight, in documentation. When the agency sent over a profile for someone named Lena Morales, Richard barely skimmed it at first. 34. Experience in assisted living, private home care, hospice support. Nothing flashy. He scheduled the interview out of obligation more than hope. Daniel wasn't present. Richard didn't ask him to be. That would change later. On the day of the interview, Lena arrived 10 minutes early. She didn't check her phone. She didn't comment on the house. She sat calmly, hands folded, and waited. When Richard asked her about difficult patients, she didn't launch into a rehearsed story. "I don't think people are difficult," she said. "I think they're overwhelmed." It was the first answer in weeks that made Richard pause. As the interview continued, the cameras recorded nothing unusual. But somewhere in the quiet exchange between them, something shifted. Richard didn't know it yet. But for the first time in months, a new variable had entered the system. And systems, no matter how carefully designed, never behave the same once that happens. Lena Morales met Daniel Holloway the same way she met most people in her line of work. Without assumptions. She entered his room quietly, not because she was told to, but because she noticed the way sound carried in the house. The faint echo. The way footsteps announced themselves long before a person arrived. "Hi, Daniel," she said, standing where he could see her clearly. "I'm Lena." Daniel shifted his eyes toward her. He took in her face, her posture, the way she didn't immediately reach for him. "Hi," he said. "I'm here to help with your care," Lena continued. "But I'd rather you tell me what that means to you." Daniel blinked, surprised. "I don't know." "That's okay," she said. "We'll figure it out." She waited. Most caregivers filled the space with instructions or reassurance. Lena let the silence sit. It didn't feel heavy. It felt respectful. Richard watched from the doorway, arms crossed. He noted the lack of theatrics, the absence of forced warmth. "So," Lena said gently, "would you like me to explain what I'm going to do before I do it?" "Yes," Daniel said immediately. Lena nodded. "Okay." Every movement that followed came with permission. She asked before adjusting pillows, before repositioning his arm, before checking vitals. She narrated without infantilizing him, her voice calm and neutral. Daniel relaxed almost imperceptibly. Richard felt it before he fully understood it. A subtle shift in the room. Less tension. More presence. Later that afternoon, Richard checked the cameras out of habit. Lena sat in a chair beside Daniel's bed, folding a stack of clean laundry. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't hovering. She wasn't talking unnecessarily. "What were you studying?" she asked casually. "Engineering," Daniel said. "What kind?" "Biomedical." Lena nodded. "Makes sense." Daniel frowned slightly. "Why?" "People who pay attention to how things work usually want to fix what doesn't," she said. Daniel considered that. "I volunteered at a rehab clinic." "That explains it too." Daniel's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Richard replayed that clip later. Twice. Over the next week, patterns emerged. Daniel spoke more when Lena was around. Not dramatically. Just more. He answered questions fully instead of with single words. He corrected her gently when she misunderstood something. She listened. One evening, she brought him tea without asking. "Chamomile," she said. "Unless you hate it." "I don't hate it," Daniel said. "That's high praise," she replied, a hint of humor in her voice. Daniel let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. Richard noticed the change in himself too. He checked the cameras less frequently during Lena's shifts. He trusted the calm he saw. But trust made him uneasy. He reminded himself that this was temporary, that people disappointed eventually. One afternoon, Lena asked Daniel, "Do you want music on?" Daniel thought for a moment. "Not really." "Okay," she said, and turned nothing on. That small act stuck with Richard more than it should have. A few days later, Richard walked past Daniel's room and heard voices. Not loud, not tense, normal. "Did you always want to work in healthcare?" Lena asked. "No," Daniel said. "I wanted to build things." "You still can." Daniel's voice softened. "I don't know how." Lena didn't answer right away. "You don't have to know yet," she said. The cameras caught Daniel staring at the ceiling afterward, thoughtful rather than distant. For the first time since the accident, Richard saw something unfamiliar on his son's face. Not hope, but curiosity. And curiosity, Richard knew, could be dangerous, because it meant imagining a future. And imagining a future meant risking disappointment. As Richard closed the camera feed that night, he told himself to stay alert, to stay rational. He didn't notice how long it had been since Daniel said, "I'm fine." And he didn't notice that the quiet in the house felt different now. Less empty, more expectant. The first problem arrived quietly. It came disguised as routine. Lena noticed it while helping Daniel with his morning stretches. His left hand trembled just slightly when he tried to grip the foam bar. It wasn't dramatic. If you weren't watching closely, you'd miss it. She didn't say anything at first. "Want to take a break?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "No. I've got it." He tried again. The tremor returned, sharper this time. Daniel exhaled slowly, frustration tightening his jaw. "It wasn't doing that yesterday." Lena kept her voice steady. "Bodies change day to day, especially when they're healing. Or when they're getting worse," Daniel said. That stopped her. She crouched slightly so they were eye level. "Let's note it," she said. "Not panic. Just note it." Daniel searched her face. "You think it matters." "I think everything matters," she replied. "But not everything is bad." He nodded, though the tension didn't fully leave his shoulders. Later that day, Lena documented the tremor in her notes and flagged it for the visiting therapist. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't downplay it either. Richard saw the report that evening. He read it twice, then a third time. The word tremor sat on the page like a quiet threat. At dinner, Richard barely touched his food. Margaret noticed, of course. "You're brooding," she said lightly. "That's never good for digestion." "There's a note from the caregiver," Richard replied. Margaret's smile tightened. "Another one?" Daniel's hand. "What about it?" "Tremor." Margaret waved a dismissive hand. "He's had worse days." Richard didn't respond. He'd learned that arguing with Margaret rarely led anywhere useful. That night, he stood outside Daniel's room longer than usual before knocking. "Dad," Daniel said when he entered. "Everything okay?" Richard forced a smile. "Just checking in." Daniel studied him. "You read the report." It wasn't a question. Richard sighed. "I did." "It's not a big deal," Daniel said quickly. Too quickly. Richard sat down. "Your caregiver noticed it early." "That's good." Daniel looked away. "She notices everything." There was something in his tone. Not annoyance. Respect. Richard filed that away. The next day, the therapist confirmed the tremor was likely temporary. Muscle fatigue. Neurological recalibration. "Nothing alarming," he said. "But keep monitoring." Lena nodded. Daniel relaxed visibly. Richard should have relaxed too. Instead, he watched Lena more closely after that. Not because he suspected incompetence. Because he suspected attachment. He noticed how Daniel waited for Lena's reactions. How his eyes followed her movements. How the room felt emptier when she wasn't there. One afternoon, Richard overheard laughter. Actual laughter. It came from Daniel's room. Richard paused in the hallway. "You're terrible at cards," Daniel said. Lena laughed. I warned you. You cheated. I absolutely did not. You distracted me on purpose. With my stunning personality? Daniel laughed again, softer this time. Maybe. Richard felt something twist in his chest. Something complicated. That evening, Margaret finally voiced what she'd been circling for days. She's getting too close, she said, sipping her wine. Caregivers shouldn't blur boundaries. Richard didn't answer immediately. She's doing her job, he said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Is she? Yes, Richard said more sharply than intended. Margaret studied him. You like her? Richard stood. That's not relevant. Everything is relevant, Margaret replied coolly. The next morning, Lena arrived to find Daniel unusually quiet. You okay? She asked. He hesitated. Did I do something wrong? Her heart dipped. Why would you think that? My dad's been weird. Lena smiled gently. Your dad worries. That's his hobby. Daniel snorted despite himself. Then his smile faded. What if this gets better, and then worse again? Lena didn't answer right away. She pulled a chair closer and Saturday, then we deal with it, she said. One day at a time. And if people leave? Daniel asked. Lena met his eyes. I don't make promises I can't keep. Daniel swallowed. But you're not planning to leave. Lena hesitated. Just for a second. Long enough for Daniel to notice. Outside the room, Richard stopped short. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but he heard the silence. And silence, he knew, always meant something was coming. The silence followed Lena for the rest of the day. It sat heavy in her chest while she helped Daniel eat lunch. It lingered while she adjusted his brace. It even followed her into the hallway when she stepped out to speak with the visiting nurse. She hadn't meant to hesitate. But Daniel had asked the one question she never allowed herself to answer too confidently. She was finishing her shift when Richard stopped her near the stairs. Lena, he said. A moment? She turned, instantly professional. Of course. They stood a few feet apart. The house felt larger at night, quieter. The hum of the security system buzzed faintly under the silence. I've noticed something, Richard said. Her stomach tightened. Okay. You document carefully. You follow instructions. You're observant. He paused. But you also improvise. She kept her face neutral. Within safe limits. That's not what I'm asking. She waited. You talk to my son like he's not fragile, Richard continued. Like he's just a person. Lena nodded. Because he is. Richard studied her for a long moment. Most caregivers tiptoe around him. You don't. I won't lie to him, she said. And I won't treat him like glass. That can be dangerous. It can also be necessary. Richard exhaled slowly. You're aware this house has extensive monitoring? Yes, Lena said. You mentioned it during orientation. Every room except bathrooms, he added. For safety. She met his gaze. I assume you're watching. I review footage, Richard said carefully. Not constantly. Lena didn't flinch. Then you know I haven't crossed any lines. That depends on what you consider a line. Something in his tone shifted. Less employer. More father. Daniel laughs with you, Richard said. He opens up. That's new. Lena chose her words. Connection isn't misconduct. Attachment can be, Richard replied. She nodded. Then maybe we should define the difference. The air thickened between them. Richard finally looked away. Just be mindful. I am, Lena said. Every minute. That night, she lay awake replaying Daniel's question. You're not planning to leave. She had lied by omission. Because plans were dangerous things. The next morning, the house woke to tension. Margaret was unusually attentive at breakfast, hovering around Daniel, asking questions she usually delegated. How was your sleep? She asked. Fine, Daniel said. Why? No reason. Her eyes flicked briefly to Lena. Just checking. Lena pretended not to notice. Later, during therapy, Daniel struggled more than usual. His movements were slower. His jaw clenched. Stop, he said suddenly. Lena froze. What's wrong? I can't do it today. The therapist hesitated. We can adjust. No, Daniel snapped. I said stop. The room went quiet. Lena stepped closer. Hey, she said softly. Talk to me. His eyes burned. I heard them last night. Her heart skipped. Heard who? My dad and Margaret, Daniel said. Talking about you. Lena felt the ground shift. They think you're temporary, he continued. Like everyone else. The therapist quietly excused himself. Lena lowered herself in front of Daniel. What exactly did they say? Daniel shook his head. Doesn't matter. They always decide things without asking me. She wanted to tell him he was wrong. She couldn't. You matter, she said instead. Even when people forget to show it. Daniel laughed bitterly. Then why does everyone keep leaving? The question landed hard. Lena didn't have an answer that wouldn't hurt. That afternoon, Margaret requested a meeting. I think we need to revisit boundaries, she said, folding her hands. Daniel is becoming emotionally dependent. Richard shifted uncomfortably. That's not a diagnosis, Lena said calmly. It's an observation, Margaret replied. And I don't like surprises. Neither do I, Lena said. Which is why transparency matters. Margaret smiled thinly. Then you won't mind knowing that I've requested a full review of the footage. Lena's pulse spiked. From when? From your first day, Margaret said. Just to be thorough. Richard looked startled. That's excessive. Is it? Margaret asked. If everything is appropriate, there's nothing to worry about. Lena forced herself to breathe. She had nothing to hide. Except one thing. Later that evening, alone in her small apartment, Lena opened her laptop. She replayed the memories she'd buried. The hospital room. The accident. The man in the bed who looked nothing like Daniel, yet somehow exactly like him. The file she'd sworn never to open again. She stared at the name on the screen. And realized the footage might reveal more than Margaret expected. The footage review began 2 days later. Lena knew the exact moment it started because the house felt different. Not colder. Not hostile. Just alert. Like it was holding its breath. She moved carefully that morning, aware of her posture, her tone, the way she stood near Daniel's chair. Not because she was doing anything wrong, but because being watched changes how time moves. Daniel noticed. You're quiet, he said while she helped him with breakfast. Just thinking, Lena replied. About what? About how strong you've gotten, she said, lifting his arms slightly during stretches. This would have been impossible 2 months ago. He studied her. You're deflecting. She smiled. Maybe a little. He leaned back. They're reviewing the cameras, aren't they? Lena didn't answer. Daniel exhaled sharply. Figures. He stared at the window. I feel like a science project. You're not, Lena said. You're a person in a house full of worried people. That's worse, he muttered. Mid-morning, Margaret appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand. Daniel, she said sweetly, we're going to have lunch with the family physician tomorrow. Daniel stiffened. Why? Routine. Lena caught the way Margaret's eyes flicked to her. That afternoon, Lena was asked to step out of the house for 30 minutes while a system diagnostic ran. It was phrased politely. It felt like exile. She sat in her car and tried not to imagine what was being rewound. Every stretch, every pause, every conversation, every silence. When she returned, Daniel was withdrawn. You okay? She asked. They paused the video, he said. Her heart thudded. Which one? The one from the storm last month. Lena's fingers tightened around the wheelchair handle. The storm. The power outage. The emergency generator lagging. The cameras going dark. What about it? She asked carefully. Daniel swallowed. They wanted to know why I was in pain before the power went out. Lena's chest tightened. That night, Daniel continued, you helped me stretch because my legs were locking up. Yes. But on the footage, he said, it looks like I was already upset before that. Lena remembered. He'd been shaking. Not from pain. From fear. Did they ask you? She said. They asked you, Daniel replied quietly. Lena felt the floor tilt. That evening Richard called her into his office. The walls were lined with framed awards. Lena barely saw them. We reviewed a section of the footage, Richard said. From the storm. Okay. You deviated from protocol. Yes, Lena said evenly. I did. Margaret leaned forward. You moved him without authorization. He was in pain, Lena said. And I'm trained to handle muscle spasms. You also turned off the audio feed, Margaret added. Lena met her gaze. Because he was crying. Silence. You're not allowed to disable recording, Margaret said. I know, Lena replied. I made a judgment call. Richard rubbed his temples. Why? Lena took a breath. Because he asked me to. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. And you decided that outweighed house policy. Yes. Richard looked at her. Do you understand how that appears? I do, Lena said. But I also understand what it feels like to be trapped in a body that won't respond with strangers watching. Margaret's eyes sharpened. That's an interesting thing to say. Lena didn't respond. You were emotional, Margaret continued. Caregivers should remain objective. I was human, Lena said. There's a difference. Richard stood. We need time to consider this. Lena nodded. I understand. As she turned to leave, Richard spoke again. Why did Daniel trust you enough to ask that? Lena paused. Because I didn't pretend he was fine, she said. And because I know what it's like. That night, Daniel called her phone. I heard, he said. I'm sorry, Lena replied. For what? He asked. For treating me like I mattered? She swallowed. I might be suspended. There was a long pause. Then they'll prove my point, Daniel said quietly. After the call, Lena sat in the dark. She thought about the other hospital room. The other body. The accident that had taught her exactly how thin the line was between help and helplessness. And she realized the cameras weren't the real danger. The truth was, the suspension came the next morning. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just a quiet email waiting in Lena's inbox when she woke up. Administrative leave. Pending further review. She stared at the words for a long time before closing the laptop. No anger. No tears. Just a dull pressure behind her eyes, like a headache that refused to peak. Daniel found out before she could tell him. He called within minutes. They told me, he said. His voice was controlled, which scared her more than shouting would have. They said it was temporary. I'm sorry, Lena said again. Stop apologizing, Daniel snapped. Then, softer, did you know this would happen? She hesitated. I knew it was possible. You still did it. Yes. Why? He asked. Because it was the right thing? Or because of whatever you're not telling me? Lena closed her eyes. That's not fair, she said gently. Neither is this, Daniel replied. They're punishing you for listening to me. There was a knock at her apartment door mid-call. I have to go, Lena said. I'll explain when I'm allowed back. If, Daniel said. The line went dead. At the house, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Daniel refused therapy. Again. He refused meals unless Richard brought them himself. He ignored Margaret entirely. You can't take this out on us, Richard said quietly one evening. Daniel looked at him. I'm not. I'm responding. Margaret crossed her arms. You're being difficult. No, Daniel said. I'm being honest. The words hung there heavy. Meanwhile, the footage review continued. Margaret sat alone most afternoons, headphones on, fast-forwarding, rewinding, slowing moments down. She wasn't looking for kindness. She was looking for proof. Something improper. Something emotional. Something she could point to and say, see? Instead, she found patterns. Lena adjusting Daniel's brace before he complained. Lena noticing changes in his breathing before alarms triggered. Lena pausing when he went quiet, waiting instead of rushing. It annoyed her, because it wasn't misconduct. It was competence. Then she reached an older clip. One that wasn't supposed to be relevant. The date caught her eye. Nearly 2 years ago. Before Lena was ever hired. Margaret frowned. The camera angle was wrong. Lower. Temporary. Hospital equipment. She checked the system log. The footage wasn't from the house. It had been imported. Archive. Forgotten. She clicked play. The room was unmistakably a hospital recovery ward. A man lay in bed, motionless from the waist down. Younger than Daniel. Different face. But the posture was familiar. So was the stillness. The camera zoomed slightly. A woman entered the frame. Lena. Margaret's breath caught. The timestamp predated Lena's employment by almost 18 months. The woman on the screen looked thinner, paler, her movements slower. But it was her. She sat beside the hospital bed and spoke softly to the man. The audio was faint, but one sentence came through clearly. I know what it's like, Lena said. I won't leave you alone with this. Margaret's pulse quickened. She scrubbed forward. The man in the bed turned his head slightly, struggling. His voice was hoarse. They said I might never walk again. Lena reached for his hand. I know, she said. They told me the same thing. Margaret froze the frame. Same thing. The realization landed hard. Lena wasn't just empathetic. She was experienced. Personal experience. Margaret immediately called Richard. You need to see something, she said. That evening, Richard sat in front of the monitor, arms crossed, jaw tight. He watched the clip in silence. This was before she came here, Margaret said. She never disclosed it. Richard didn't answer. She has a personal history of paralysis, Margaret continued. And she didn't think that mattered? Richard leaned forward. He rewound the footage. Watched Lena's face. The way she leaned in. The familiarity of her touch. That explains it, Margaret said. The attachment. The projection. No, Richard said slowly. It explains the skill. Margaret turned to him sharply. She lied by omission. Richard stood. Or she chose not to center herself. Margaret stared at him. You're defending her. I'm understanding her, Richard replied. There was a difference. Later that night, Richard went to Daniel's room. We need to talk, he said. Daniel didn't look up. About firing the only person who treats me like a human? About why, Richard said. Daniel frowned. Why what? Why she understands you better than anyone we've hired. Daniel's chest tightened. What did you find? Richard hesitated. Then said, she's been where you are. Daniel's breath caught. What do you mean? Richard looked him straight in the eye. She didn't just study paralysis, son. She survived it. Daniel's hands trembled. And for the first time since Lena left, hope and fear collided in his chest at the same time. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying his father's words again and again. She survived it. Not worked with it. Not studied it. Survived it. The idea rearranged everything he thought he knew about Lena. Her patience. Her refusal to rush him. The way she never spoke in false optimism. The way she never looked surprised when his body failed him. It wasn't sympathy. It was memory. The next morning, Daniel demanded answers. Bring her back, he told Richard flatly over breakfast. Richard set his coffee down. It's not that simple. It is, Daniel said. You suspended her. You can unsuspend her. Margaret stiffened. We're still reviewing? I don't care, Daniel snapped. You dug into her past without asking. You owe her more than silence. Margaret's lips pressed together. She concealed relevant medical history. Did she? Daniel shot back. Or did she choose not to make my suffering about her? The room went quiet. Richard studied his son carefully. You want to talk to her? Daniel nodded. I need to. There was a pause. I'll arrange it, Richard said finally. Margaret's head turned sharply. Richard. Enough, he said. This isn't about policy anymore. That afternoon, Lena received a message she didn't expect. Richard, Daniel would like to see you. Neutral location. 1 hour. Her hands shook as she typed back a simple yes. They met at a small rehabilitation center cafe near the river. Public. Quiet. Neutral, just as Richard promised. Daniel arrived first, his chair already positioned near the window. When Lena walked in, he looked up and froze. She stopped short too. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel said softly, You didn't tell me. Lena swallowed. No. Why? She sat across from him. Because it wasn't about me. Daniel laughed once, bitter and shaky. Everything about you has been about me. She winced. That's not what I meant. I trusted you, he said. And now I don't know what I trusted. The words cut deeper than anger would have. Lena nodded slowly. That's fair. Daniel stared at her. So say it. Say what happened. She hesitated. Not because she didn't want to. Because once spoken, it would stop being hers alone. Car accident, she said quietly. 4 years ago. Drunk driver. Rear-ended me at a stoplight. Daniel's fingers curled against his armrest. Spinal injury, she continued. Incomplete. Doctors were careful with words. No promises. He leaned forward slightly. How long? Almost 2 years, she said. Wheelchair. Then walker. Then cane. Silence stretched between them. You walked again? Daniel said. Yes. He looked down. I might not. Lena didn't rush to answer. I don't know, she said. And anyone who tells you they do is lying. Daniel's jaw tightened. So you stayed because you thought you could fix me? No, she said firmly. I stayed because I knew what not being fixed feels like. He looked up sharply. I know the panic, she said. The anger. The way people talk around you instead of to you. I stayed because you deserved someone who didn't disappear when progress slowed. Daniel's eyes burned. Then why didn't you tell me? Because hope is fragile, Lena said. And I didn't want to turn myself into a comparison. He breathed out slowly. I would have understood, he said. Maybe, she replied. Or maybe you would have tried to become me. That landed. Daniel leaned back, staring out the window. You think I would have chased your outcome instead of my own? Yes, she said gently. Because I've seen it happen. The truth of it hurt. A lot. But it also rang uncomfortably true. After a long pause, Daniel said, They watched everything, didn't they? Yes. And still couldn't find anything wrong. No. A faint smile touched his mouth. Figures. He looked at her again. Do you regret it? Lena thought about the suspension. The scrutiny. The invasion. Then she thought about the night of the storm. His shaking. His voice breaking when he thought no one was listening. No, she said. I don't. Daniel nodded slowly. Outside, Richard watched through the cafe window from a distance, his phone pressed to his ear. Margaret's voice crackled through the speaker. This is getting out of hand. No, Richard said quietly. It's getting clear. You're letting her manipulate him, Margaret said. Richard didn't look away from his son. I think, he replied, she's the first person who hasn't. Inside the cafe, Daniel finally spoke again. If they ask you back, he said, will you come? Lena hesitated. Not out of fear. Out of honesty. I don't know, she said. Daniel nodded. Then I guess we're both waiting. Neither of them noticed Margaret's car parked across the street, or the way she watched them, or the decision forming quietly behind her eyes. Margaret didn't act immediately. That was what made her dangerous. She waited 3 days after the cafe meeting. 3 days of watching the house settle into a tense, unnatural quiet. Daniel resumed therapy, but only mechanically. Richard grew distracted enough to forget meetings and miss calls. And Lena remained absent, but present in every room like an echo. Margaret noticed everything. She noticed how Daniel flinched whenever a new caregiver tried to help him. How he corrected them with phrases Lena used to say. How he shut down the moment he felt rushed. She would have waited, he told one aide flatly. Margaret dismissed the aide by noon. That afternoon, Margaret made a call she hadn't planned to make so soon. She dialed the private investigator she'd used once before years ago, during a board dispute she never spoke about. I need a full background, she said. Not surface level. Medical, employment, litigation. Everything. The man on the other end hesitated. She already passed. I'm not asking if she passed, Margaret said calmly. I'm asking what she didn't say. The line went quiet. Meanwhile, Lena tried to return to something resembling normal life. She picked up extra shifts at the rehab center. She avoided checking her phone too often. She told herself the suspension was temporary, that she'd survived worse. Still, every time the elevator doors opened and she saw a wheelchair roll out, her chest tightened. Daniel haunted her thoughts more than she wanted to admit. On the 4th day, Richard requested another meeting. This time it wasn't neutral. It was at the house. Lena stood in the foyer, acutely aware of how strange it felt to be back. The cameras were still there. The silence was heavier. Richard greeted her with a tired smile. Thank you for coming. Daniel was already in the living room. He looked thinner, sharper around the edges. You look like hell, he said. She smiled faintly. Occupational hazard. They didn't sit. Richard got straight to the point. I want you back. Lena's breath caught despite herself. Margaret wasn't in the room. On one condition, Richard continued. Full disclosure. Past, present. No omissions. Lena nodded slowly. That's fair. And another, he added. Daniel needs to consent. Fully. No pressure. Daniel didn't hesitate. I consent. Lena turned to him. Daniel. I know what I'm choosing, he said. That matters to me. Richard exhaled, some tension leaving his shoulders. Then we're agreed. Before Lena could respond, Margaret entered. Her timing was perfect. I'm glad everyone's together, she said. Because I have concerns. Daniel's jaw tightened. Of course you do. Margaret ignored him. She placed a thin folder on the table. My investigator finished his report, she said. And there are things we should discuss before any decisions are made. Lena felt the room tilt. Richard frowned. You hired someone? I protected this family, Margaret replied coolly. She opened the folder. Did you know, Margaret said, that Lena was involved in a malpractice claim? Richard stiffened. Daniel's head snapped up. What? Daniel said. Lena's mouth went dry. Margaret continued. The hospital where she was treated. She testified. The case settled quietly. That doesn't mean, Richard began. It means, Margaret interrupted, that she has a documented history of conflict with medical institutions. A potential bias. Lena found her voice. I testified because they ignored my symptoms. And one, Margaret said. Which makes this even more concerning. Daniel stared at Lena. You sued them? Yes, Lena said quietly. Because they discharged me when I couldn't feel my feet. Silence slammed into the room. Margaret pressed on. She also worked briefly as a patient advocate. Left abruptly. I left because I burned out, Lena said. Because watching people get dismissed nearly broke me. Margaret closed the folder. Or because you blur lines. That's enough, Richard snapped. No, Daniel said suddenly. It's not. He looked at Lena. Is there anything else? The question wasn't accusatory. It was terrified. Lena swallowed. No, she said. Nothing that affects my ability to care for you honestly. Daniel nodded slowly. Margaret studied him. You're choosing emotion over reason. Daniel met her gaze. No. I'm choosing someone who doesn't treat me like a liability. Margaret's eyes hardened. Then you're making yourself vulnerable. Maybe, Daniel replied. But at least it's my choice. The room vibrated with unspoken consequences. Richard looked between them, the weight of authority pressing down. I'll review everything tonight, he said finally. No decisions until morning. Margaret turned to leave, satisfied enough for now. As Lena gathered her bag, Daniel spoke quietly. She's not done, he said. Lena nodded. Neither am I. Outside, as Lena stepped into the evening air, her phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number. She answered. Miss Carter? A man asked. Yes. This is regarding the accident 4 years ago, he said. New information has come to light. Lena stopped walking. Information about the other driver, he continued. You might want to sit down. The line went quiet. And Lena realized Margaret wasn't digging into the past. She was digging up something that was never supposed to surface. Lena didn't sit down. She leaned against the stone wall outside the house, the cold seeping through her coat as the man on the phone cleared his throat. What kind of information? She asked. A reopened toxicology report, he said. And a name that didn't appear in the original file. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Why now? There was a sealed supplement, he replied. It was released last week after a related civil case closed. Lena's pulse hammered. Related to what? To your former employer, the man said carefully. Not the hospital. The advocacy nonprofit. Her breath caught. The call ended with a promise to send documents by morning. Lena stood there long after the screen went dark. Inside the house, Daniel watched her through the window. He could tell something was wrong by the way she didn't move. The way her shoulders curved inward, protective. He turned to his father. She got bad news. Richard followed his gaze. I can see that. Are you going to do anything? Daniel asked. Richard hesitated. She's not officially back yet. Daniel's voice sharpened. That's not what I asked. Richard exhaled and stood. He stepped outside. Lena, he said quietly. She turned, startled. Then forced a neutral expression. I'm okay. You don't look okay, he replied. She considered lying. Instead, she said, the accident might not have been as random as I was told. Richard's brow furrowed. Explain. Tomorrow, she said. When I know what's real. Richard studied her face. Margaret's investigator? Indirectly, Lena replied. Richard's jaw tightened. She crossed a line. Not yet, Lena said. But she's close. That night, sleep refused to come. Lena read the documents as soon as they arrived at dawn. Police memos. Internal emails. A toxicology addendum stamped confidential. The driver hadn't just been drunk. He'd been high on prescription opioids. Prescribed by a pain clinic under investigation at the time. A clinic Lena had testified against months before her accident. Her chest constricted. The driver's name appeared again in another file. A deposition. A donor list. Linked to the nonprofit's board. She closed the laptop slowly. It hadn't been random. Someone had protected someone else. Across town, Margaret sat at her desk, reviewing her own packet. The investigator's findings were thinner than she'd hoped. No scandal. No disqualifying behavior. Just a woman who'd been hurt and refused to stay quiet. Margaret felt irritation crawl up her spine. Then her phone rang. Yes, she said sharply. I found something else, the investigator said. But it's sensitive. Margaret straightened. Go on. The driver in Lena's accident, he said. There's evidence the case was quietly steered. Suppressed reports. Pressure from donors. Margaret's lips parted slightly. And, he added, your name appears in one of the internal emails. The room seemed to tilt. That's impossible, Margaret said. You were copied, he replied. On a thread requesting discretion. Margaret's hand tightened around the phone. Send me everything. She hung up and sat very still. Memory surfaced unwanted. A fundraiser. A late-night call. A request framed as harmless. She hadn't caused the accident. But she hadn't asked questions either. Down the hall, Daniel struggled through therapy alone. His new caregiver followed instructions but missed cues. Missed pauses. Stop, Daniel said. The caregiver froze. Pain? No, Daniel replied. You're not listening. He waved her out. When Richard arrived, Daniel spoke before he could. She knows, Daniel said. Richard frowned. Knows what? Whatever Margaret's hiding, Daniel replied. I can feel it. Richard didn't dismiss him. Later that afternoon, Lena returned to the house. She hadn't been summoned. She came anyway. Margaret met her in the hallway. You're bold, Margaret said coolly. So are you, Lena replied. They stood inches apart. You should let this go, Margaret said. Digging into old wounds helps no one. You helped bury them, Lena said softly. Margaret's eyes flickered. That driver, Lena continued. He wasn't protected by chance. He was protected by money. Margaret's voice dropped. Be careful. I am, Lena said. That's why I'm telling Richard. Margaret's composure cracked just slightly. You don't understand what you're risking, she said. Lena met her gaze. Neither did you. Behind them, Daniel's voice cut through the tension. Dad, he said. I need you. Now. They turned. Daniel sat rigid in his chair, face pale, one hand trembling uncontrollably. Lena moved instinctively toward him. Margaret stepped back. Richard crossed the room quickly. What's happening? He asked. Daniel swallowed hard. I can't feel my left side. The words landed like a gunshot. Lena's mind snapped into focus. Margaret's secrets could wait. Right now Daniel was slipping. And this time there were no cameras she cared about. Only time. Daniel's sudden weakness hit like a storm. One moment he was gripping the armrest of his wheelchair, focused on the therapist's instructions. The next, his left hand trembled violently, his leg twitched unnaturally. He looked up at Lena, eyes wide with panic. I can't, his voice cracked. I can't feel my left side. Lena was immediately at his side, her hand steady as she checked his brace and repositioned him carefully. Breathe, Daniel. I've got you. We're going to take this slow. Richard was already there, moving faster than his own body seemed capable of. Call the doctor, he barked. Now. Margaret hovered near the doorway, composed on the surface, but her eyes betrayed worry. It's probably temporary, she said, though even she didn't sound convinced. The emergency physician arrived within the hour. Tests, scans, and vital checks followed in rapid succession. Lena stayed close to Daniel, speaking softly, narrating every motion and every touch, giving him something solid to focus on. The tremor, and now this sudden weakness, the doctor muttered, flipping through charts. It could be neurological. We'll know more after the MRI. Daniel's panic ebbed and flowed in waves. What if it's permanent? He whispered to Lena during a quiet moment. She held his hand, refusing to lie. Then we adapt. We figure it out. But you're not there yet. You're not done. Richard watched from the corner, jaw tight. He caught Margaret's glance, a mixture of concern and something else, something calculating. He realized sharply that the crisis was pulling more than just Daniel into chaos. It was revealing fault lines in the house itself. Hours passed. Lena remained tethered to Daniel, guiding him through small movements, breathing exercises, even casual conversation to keep his mind present. The house had gone silent. The camera seemed almost irrelevant now. Finally, the doctor returned with preliminary results. No new lesions. No evidence of stroke. It appears to be a flare from nerve inflammation. Aggressive therapy can help. Daniel exhaled shakily, a mixture of relief and fear. I thought this was it. You're strong, Lena said, voice steady but soft. Stronger than you know. But the relief didn't last long. Richard noticed the subtle twitch in Daniel's eye, the slight asymmetry in his hand as he tried to grip a cup. Something still wasn't right. Later that evening, as Lena helped Daniel back into bed, she whispered almost to herself, "It's connected to the stress. The constant tension in the house. You're sensing more than you let on." Daniel's eyes widened. "You think Margaret?" "Yes," Lena said quietly. "Her presence, her scrutiny, it's affecting your body. I can feel it too. Fear manifests physically." Richard, standing nearby, clenched his fists. "I'll handle it," he said, voice tight. But Lena shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "You can't fix this with rules or cameras. He needs calm. He needs safety. And right now, that's me." The revelation shifted the dynamic in the house. Margaret's influence, which had always been subtle and controlling, now felt like a tangible weight pressing on Daniel's muscles, his nerves, his very breathing. That night, Lena stayed in the room, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm. She whispered reminders of small victories, past progress, the ways his body had defied expectation before. Slowly, his tremors eased and his breathing steadied. Yet the undercurrent of fear remained. Margaret's footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, deliberate, precise. Lena knew she was watching, waiting for any misstep to exploit. And Richard, though protective, was still caught in the balance, torn between policy, family, and trust. Daniel finally whispered, "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep feeling like I'm breaking every time someone watches." Lena's hand tightened slightly. "Then we change the rules. We control what we can. You and I, step by step." He nodded slowly, exhausted but relieved. And in that moment, Lena realized something she hadn't admitted before. This wasn't just about caregiving. This was about survival, hers, his, and the fragile trust that held the house together. Outside, unseen, Margaret's gaze lingered longer than necessary. And somewhere deep in Lena's mind, she knew that the confrontation was only beginning. Because fear, once physical, is harder to contain. And the next move would change everything. The house shifted after Daniel's episode. Not in obvious ways. No slammed doors. No raised voices. Just small things. The camera stayed on, but no one mentioned them. Meals were quieter. Footsteps softened instinctively near Daniel's room, like everyone was afraid of triggering something unseen. Daniel himself changed. He was calmer on the surface, but something guarded had taken root behind his eyes. He listened more than he spoke. When Margaret entered a room, his body stiffened before his mind caught up. Lena noticed. She always did. That morning, during gentle mobility work, Daniel's breathing grew shallow the moment Margaret's voice floated down the hallway. Lena paused immediately. "We stop," she said. "I didn't say," Daniel began. "You don't have to," Lena replied. She waited. No rushing. No instructions. Daniel's shoulders slowly lowered. His breathing evened out. "Your body reacts before you do," Lena said quietly. "That's not weakness. That's information." Daniel stared at his hands. "Then my body doesn't trust this house anymore." The words hung heavy between them. Across the hall, Richard watched through the partially open door. He saw the difference. With Lena, Daniel's tension softened. Without her, it spiked. This wasn't emotional dependence. It was regulation. That afternoon, Richard requested a private conversation with Margaret. Not in his office. In the sitting room where nothing had ever been discussed honestly. "I need you to step back," Richard said. Margaret's posture remained elegant. "From what, exactly?" "From Daniel," he replied. "From decisions that affect his care." She laughed softly. "You're letting a suspended employee dictate boundaries now?" "I'm letting my son's health dictate them," Richard said. Margaret's eyes cooled. "This is about guilt." Richard stiffened. "Excuse me?" "You've convinced yourself Lena is some kind of corrective force," Margaret said. "A way to atone for everything you couldn't fix." "That's not fair," Richard snapped. "No," Margaret said. "It's accurate." Richard leaned forward. "You hired an investigator without telling me. You dug into a woman's trauma and used it as leverage." "I protected us," Margaret said sharply. "You protected control," Richard shot back. Silence stretched. Then Margaret said quietly, "If you let her stay, this family fractures." Richard met her gaze. "If I don't, it already has." Meanwhile, Lena received an email that made her hands shake. It wasn't from the family. It was from a legal firm. Regarding reopened liability in the accident. The words blurred as she read them. Margaret hadn't just reopened old wounds. She'd triggered consequences. That evening, Daniel sensed the tension without being told. "You're leaving again?" he said suddenly as Lena helped him into bed. She froze. "Why would you think that?" "Because everything goes quiet before something breaks," he said. Lena sat on the edge of the bed. "I don't want to leave." "That's not an answer," Daniel replied. She exhaled slowly. "I might be forced to deal with something from my past. It doesn't mean I disappear." Daniel looked at her. "Everyone says that." She met his eyes. "I won't lie to you. But I won't vanish either." He nodded, unconvinced but listening. Later that night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He replayed the episode again and again. The numbness, the panic, the way his body betrayed him. Finally, he reached for his phone and did something he'd never done before. He turned the cameras off. Just in his room. The screen blinked once, then went dark. For the first time in months, he felt alone in a way that wasn't threatening. He called Lena. "I did something," he said quietly. "What?" she asked. "I turned them off." There was a pause. "Are you safe?" Lena asked. "Yes," he replied. "I think I'm calmer." Lena closed her eyes. "Okay," she said. "Then stay there. Breathe." "What if they notice?" Daniel asked. "They will," Lena said. "But let me handle that." Across the house, an alert flashed on Margaret's tablet. Camera offline. Her jaw tightened. She marched toward Daniel's room, and stopped short when she saw Richard already standing there, blocking the door. "He needs space," Richard said. "He violated protocol," Margaret replied. "He reclaimed autonomy," Richard said. They stared at each other. Margaret's voice dropped. "You're choosing her over me." Richard didn't flinch. "I'm choosing him." Inside the room, Daniel lay back, heart pounding but steady. For the first time since the accident, the silence didn't feel like surveillance. It felt like control. But outside, the consequences were aligning. Legal pressure. Power struggles. Secrets unraveling. And Lena knew one thing with absolute clarity. This wasn't about whether she stayed or left anymore. It was about who would be allowed to tell the truth. And who would be exposed by it. The house had changed. Not physically. The furniture hadn't moved. The cameras still blinked faintly in every corner. But the air itself carried tension differently. Margaret didn't speak much anymore. She lingered in the background, watching, waiting, calculating. Her influence had been bluntly countered, but she wasn't gone. Not yet. Richard, on the other hand, was quieter. He didn't give orders so much as observe, waiting to intervene if necessary. Watching Lena and Daniel navigate their own rhythm without interference. Daniel had learned to pace himself. to breathe through tension, to recognize when he was reacting to someone else's stress and when it was truly his own body telling him something. Lena stayed beside him, teaching more than therapy, teaching trust, teaching patience, teaching him to feel safe without surrendering control. One afternoon, as sunlight fell across the hardwood floor, Daniel turned to Lena with a seriousness that stopped her mid-motion. "Tell me the truth about the driver," he said quietly. Lena's stomach tightened. "I've told you everything I know." "Everything?" he pressed. She hesitated. The documents she'd received, the revelations about connections and suppressed reports, they were still raw, dangerous. She hadn't shared them. Not yet. "I don't know all of it," she admitted. "I know enough to understand why it wasn't random, but I don't know who pulled strings or why." Daniel's hand tightened around hers. "Then we find out." That night, Lena sat at her laptop, tracing timelines, cross-referencing reports, emails, and memos. Every link she uncovered only deepened the web. Margaret had left traces too. Subtle. Intentional. A faint trail of correspondence meant to pressure and control. But Lena's instincts and experience let her follow the threads without tripping the traps. Richard watched her from the doorway. "You're going too far," he said quietly. "I'm going where I have to," Lena replied. "For Daniel." "Not for me?" he asked. "Not for you," she said firmly. "For him. That's the difference." The next morning, Lena arrived at Daniel's room with documents in hand. She laid them carefully on the table beside him. "Read," she said. "Everything you need to understand." He hesitated. "Is it safe?" "Not safe," she admitted. "Necessary." Hours passed as he absorbed the information. Names, dates, connections he hadn't known existed. The realization that his own life and Lena's had intersected with danger he hadn't imagined. I don't know what to do," he finally said. "You do," Lena replied. "You just have to choose." That night, the family gathered in the living room. Margaret was silent, watching every movement, every glance. Richard spoke first. "We need a plan," he said. "A way forward that doesn't hurt anyone unnecessarily." Margaret leaned back. "Or we need a plan that protects us from her," she said. Lena's voice cut through the tension. "No. We need a plan that protects him. That's what matters. Everything else is secondary." Daniel nodded. "She's right. This isn't about revenge or pride. It's about safety. Mine and hers." Margaret's eyes flickered with something like disbelief, then calculation. "You think you've won," she said softly. "But truth isn't always protective." "What do you mean?" Richard asked sharply. Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she stood and left the room. The door clicked behind her. Daniel leaned back, exhausted but alert. "She's not done," he whispered. "No," Lena said, "but we are ready." Outside, the city lights blinked faintly, indifferent to the quiet war unfolding in the Whitmore estate, an unseen battle over trust, truth, and survival. And Lena knew that the next confrontation wouldn't just be about control. It would be about exposure. Because Margaret's secrets were coming to light. And Lena had the proof. Only one question remained. Would the revelation heal or destroy everything? The tension that had been coiled for months finally snapped. It began with a knock at the door early one morning. Lena had been reviewing files, cross-referencing documents and medical reports, trying to piece together every hidden thread of the driver's accident and Margaret's involvement. Daniel wheeled himself toward the sound, instinctively tense. Lena rose alongside him. Margaret stood at the threshold, her posture sharp, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said. Richard appeared behind her, brows furrowed. "This isn't a negotiation," he said. "It is for me," Margaret replied smoothly. "I have information that affects everyone in this house." Lena's jaw tightened. She felt a familiar surge of caution, the adrenaline that had carried her through crises before. "Go ahead," Richard said, folding his arms. Margaret opened her folder. Inside were emails, donor lists, and internal communications. Her voice was deliberate. The driver in Lena's accident wasn't acting alone. Someone on the nonprofit board had influence over how the case was handled. I discovered it recently, and it implicates several high-level donors. Daniel's eyes narrowed. And you didn't tell us sooner? I had to verify, Margaret said. I had to be certain. Lena stepped forward, her voice steady but sharp. You verified it to protect yourself. Not to protect Daniel or me. Margaret's gaze flicked to her. Careful, Miss Carter. You think you know everything. I know enough, Lena said. Enough to see what you're doing. You're trying to control the narrative just like always. Richard spoke up, voice low but commanding. Enough games. Either this is about truth or it ends here. Margaret hesitated. She looked at Daniel. For the first time, there was uncertainty in her eyes. You're right, she said finally. It is about truth. But truths have consequences. Daniel leaned forward, his voice firm. I'm ready for the consequences. I've had enough of living in fear. Enough of being treated like a liability. The room went silent. Margaret slowly closed her folder. Then you need to see everything. Full disclosure. Lena exhaled, tension easing slightly. This was the moment they had been building toward. The confrontation that would either free them or shatter the fragile trust remaining in the house. Margaret handed over a USB drive. All of it. Emails, reports, everything. Daniel took it carefully. We'll see who protected whom and who ignored what. And we'll finally set things right. Richard nodded. No one is above accountability here. Not family, not staff, not donors. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't leave immediately. Instead, she looked at Lena, eyes sharp. You've won her loyalty, she said to Daniel. But don't think for a moment that it's unconditional. Life isn't that simple. I don't need unconditional, Daniel said. I need truth. Margaret paused. Then she turned and walked away, the soft click of the door echoing in the room. Daniel looked at Lena, hands trembling slightly as he held the USB drive. I trust you, he said quietly. Lena smiled faintly. And I'll never let that trust be misplaced. For the first time in months, the house felt lighter. Cameras still monitored, policy still existed, but none of it mattered in the same way. Control had shifted to those who deserved it, the people who cared for Daniel because of who he was, not what he represented. Over the next days they reviewed the files together. Revelations emerged, donors exerting influence, internal pressure to suppress reports, attempts to minimize responsibility. Lena guided Daniel through every detail, carefully explaining what could be challenged legally and what required strategy. Richard became an ally in the process, using his influence and resources to ensure transparency and protection for Daniel. Margaret remained in the wings, her presence a reminder that power and control had not disappeared, only shifted. But she was no longer the driving force in the house. And Daniel? For the first time in his life, he felt a measure of control over his body, his environment, and his story. The numbness that had haunted him during the flare now seemed symbolic. His paralysis had been mirrored in his life, trapped by fear, surveillance, and manipulation. But now, guided by someone who truly understood him, he was moving forward. Lena sat beside him one evening, holding his hand as he reviewed a particularly complicated file. You're stronger than you think, she said softly. I only know that because you are, Daniel replied. She smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. We're learning together. Outside, the camera still recorded. Outside, Margaret still plotted. But inside, the house finally felt like a home, a place where truth, trust, and care outweighed control and fear. And for Lena and Daniel, that was the most profound victory of all. The story of surveillance, secrets, and silent battles had reached its climax. The lessons of trust, courage, and resilience would linger far longer than any camera ever could. And as the night settled over the city for the first time in years, Daniel slept without fear and Lena stayed, not just as a caregiver, but as the anchor he had needed all along. The battle was over. The war within the house had ended. And the future, finally, was theirs to shape.